He entered the courtroom with an air of entitlement, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming like a shield of superiority. His smirk told a story long before his mouth did. He had seen it all before, defendants who looked a certain way, dressed a certain way, spoke a certain way. To him, this was just another day, just another man he believed he could belittle without consequence. The moment the black man in uniform walked in, the atmosphere shifted, but not for the better. Instead of respect, there was ridicule. Instead of acknowledgement, there was mockery. It started subtly, a glance exchanged with a colleague, a barely concealed snicker, a roll of the eyes. But it didn't stay hidden for long. The officer, confident in his assumptions, allowed his biases to walk freely beside him. He leaned over to whisper something, and the person beside him stifled a laugh. A few others noticed. The mockery spread like a quiet infection in the room, unnoticed by some, but deeply felt by others. The black man stood still, his posture impeccable, his gaze steady. His uniform, though not like the others in the room, commanded its own kind of respect, if only they had recognized it. The officer's voice rose as he made a sarcastic remark under the guise of official duty. His tone dripped with condescension as he questioned the man's presence, disguising his contempt with protocol. But even in that moment, it was clear that this wasn't about process, it was about power. A game of status. The officer wanted the room to laugh with him, to affirm his superiority, to validate the image he had of himself. And for a moment, it seemed like he succeeded. A few chuckles echoed faintly, while others looked on unsure, sensing that something wasn't right but not brave enough to challenge the moment. In a place where justice was supposed to be blind, prejudice stared boldly into the face of a man who had served more honorably than most in the room could ever imagine. The black man didn't react, not with anger, not with shame. His silence wasn't weakness, it was control. He had heard laughter before. He had seen eyes that didn't believe he belonged. He had walked through fire and earned every medal stitched into his chest. But none of that mattered to the officer, who was too wrapped up in his own ego to see what was right in front of him. The courtroom buzzed with low conversations and half-glances. People shifted in their seats, unsure of how to respond. Some watched the officer, wondering how far he would go. Others watched the black man, intrigued by his calm. There was a tension in the air, a quiet that felt heavy. The mocking wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. It had weight. And so did the silence that followed. It wasn't just about disrespecting a man. It was about what that disrespect represented. In a world where appearance still dictates perception, where uniforms are supposed to equal honor, one man chose mockery over respect because of skin color. The courtroom, a place meant to uphold dignity and fairness, had become a stage for humiliation. And the black man, standing tall in his silence, became the quiet center of a moment that would soon spiral beyond anyone's expectations. The officer adjusted his collar, still amused with himself. He didn't notice the discomfort growing among the few who were more observant. He didn't see the glances being exchanged between those who were beginning to question whether his arrogance had gone too far. He didn't realize that his performance was being watched more closely than he knew. The black man said nothing, yet his presence was beginning to speak louder than any of the officer's words. Mockery in a courtroom says more about the one mocking than the one being mocked. It reveals insecurities wrapped in authority, bias disguised as duty, and fear hiding behind a badge. The laughter that echoed briefly in that room was a symptom of something deeper, something uglier. The black man had walked into the courtroom prepared to speak if needed, but now, he wouldn't need to say much at all. Because soon, the truth would speak for itself. He stood with unwavering composure, a figure of quiet authority in a room that had already cast judgment upon him. While others shifted in their seats or exchanged whispers, he remained motionless, almost statuesque, letting the chaos of their assumptions crash silently around him. The mockery hadn't shaken him, he had seen far worse than smirks and side glances. His uniform, though worn without fanfare, bore weight that few in the room could begin to understand. It wasn't the kind of uniform that came from a local department or a small-town sheriff's office. It was the kind of uniform that told stories, of sacrifice, of war, of leadership under fire. But he didn't need them to know that. Not yet. His eyes scanned the courtroom slowly, not with suspicion, but with practiced awareness. Every movement, every breath, every shift of energy was recorded in his mind. He had been trained for this, not for a courtroom, perhaps, but for moments of pressure, moments where dignity mattered more than words. The laughter and the sneers that had floated through the room hadn't touched him. They bounced off his silence like water off steel. He didn't flinch. He didn't glare. He didn't correct them. He simply stood there, holding back the truth like a secret weapon waiting to be drawn. There was power in that stillness. While others spoke without knowing, assuming without asking, he listened. He allowed them to reveal who they were without giving them any clues about who he was. That was his strength, his ability to observe, to wait, to let the truth unfold on its own terms. The officer who had mocked him continued to carry himself like a man in control. He strutted with an air of arrogance, blind to the reality standing just feet away. He believed he had the room, believed his words held weight. But the man in uniform knew something different. He knew that real authority didn't need volume. It didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, solid and undeniable. Every breath the black man took was deliberate. He had learned long ago that silence could be louder than any confrontation. That letting someone underestimate you was often the most strategic move. He had been underestimated before, on foreign soil, in government meetings, even in his own country. It was nothing new. He wore their doubt like armor. He let their prejudice pass over him, because he knew what was coming. He had the kind of patience that comes only from discipline. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone in that courtroom. Not yet. The officer continued, making comments that danced on the edge of professionalism, dripping with sarcasm, layered in coded language. He tried to mask it with procedure, but the mockery was clear. And still, the man in uniform said nothing. He stood there, his silence now beginning to feel like presence. People began to notice. Not everyone, but enough. A few furrowed brows. A few glances exchanged between those in the gallery. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Another looked at the man in uniform more closely. Questions began forming in their minds. Who is he? Why hasn't he responded? What's his role here? Still, the black man waited. He didn't react because he didn't need to. He had learned the art of silence as a tool. He had been in rooms like this before, different setting, same energy. He had endured situations where respect was earned not through demands, but through undeniable presence. And here, in this courtroom, surrounded by laughter that had begun to fade and glances that had started to linger longer, he allowed the moment to build. Every second of restraint added tension to the room, whether the mocking officer realized it or not. Something was shifting. The black man's uniform wasn't just fabric, it was history. It was rank. It was experience forged in fire. But none of that was visible to the mocking officer, who saw only what he wanted to see. And so the man in uniform let him continue. Let him dig deeper. Let him walk further into the illusion of superiority. Not out of cruelty, but because he understood the weight of revelation. When the truth came, it would be sharp. It would be swift. And it would not require a single raised voice. Until then, the black man stood, holding everything back, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The officer walked through the courtroom with the kind of confidence that had never been questioned, the kind built not on humility or wisdom but on assumption and ego. He wore his badge like a crown and spoke as though every word out of his mouth was law. Authority wasn't just his role, it was his identity. He believed that the courtroom belonged to him, that the people inside it, especially those who didn't look like him, were beneath him. When he laid eyes on the black man in uniform, that belief didn't falter, it intensified. To him, the uniform didn't mean legitimacy, it meant challenge, and that was something he couldn't accept. He didn't see the man for who he was. He saw only the surface, only the color of his skin and the assumption that followed. In his mind, a black man in uniform couldn't be important. He couldn't outrank him. He couldn't hold more power. So he reacted in the way arrogant men often do when their false sense of superiority is threatened. He mocked. He dismissed. He took aim with sarcasm and smirks, thinking that his words would establish dominance. He didn't know that every word he spoke was digging a deeper hole, not for the man in uniform, but for himself. His arrogance was loud. It showed in the way he interrupted others, in how he exaggerated his motions, how he turned conversations into performances. He was playing to an audience, craving laughter and agreement, needing others to see him as the authority figure he believed himself to be. The courtroom, to him, wasn't a place of justice, it was a stage. And he was the lead. Every glance toward the black man was filled with disdain wrapped in fake professionalism. He talked over him, questioned his right to be there, scoffed at his silence, and interpreted it as weakness. What the officer didn't realize was that his arrogance was revealing more about him than anything he said about the other man. He didn't recognize the signs that others were beginning to see. He missed the subtle shift in the air, the way people were starting to lean back, to observe rather than participate in his performance. He was too caught up in his own voice to hear the silence growing around him. His assumptions were so deeply rooted that the idea of being wrong never even entered his mind. He didn't ask the black man a single genuine question. He didn't wonder why someone so composed, so centered, was standing in silence. Because in his mind, there was no need to wonder, he already believed he knew everything. The black man stood calm, controlled, silent, not because he lacked power, but because he had far more than anyone in that room realized. And the officer, blinded by his arrogance, couldn't see it. He confused silence with submission. He mistook patience for passivity. He thought that because the man hadn't responded, he had won the exchange. He had no idea that every mocking word, every belittling gesture, was being watched, remembered, and silently stacked against him. There's a particular danger in arrogance when it blinds a person to the presence of greatness. The officer had spent his career believing in a hierarchy built on appearance, on tone, on who spoke loudest. He never considered that true strength often doesn't need to announce itself. His confidence wasn't rooted in experience or truth, but in repetition, repeating the same behaviors, the same attitudes, the same stereotypes, over and over until they hardened into belief. And that belief was so strong that even as others in the room began to feel uneasy, even as subtle cues hinted at something deeper, he remained oblivious. He continued to dominate the room with his voice, with his presence, thinking he was in control. But the irony was, the more he tried to assert control, the more obvious it became that he didn't have any. The courtroom that had once echoed his authority was beginning to turn quiet, not out of respect, but out of realization. People were watching. Not him, but the man he mocked. They were beginning to see what the officer couldn't. They were beginning to question everything he had said, every gesture he had made. And still, the officer didn't see it. He walked in believing he knew exactly who he was dealing with. He couldn't have been more wrong. The phone call came at the height of the officer's confidence, when his arrogance had taken full control of the room and the air was thick with silent tension. He had been laughing moments earlier, making another dismissive remark under the guise of professional protocol, turning the black man's silence into his personal punchline. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that someone important had just entered the narrative, not physically, but through a quiet, private vibration in someone's pocket. A call, seemingly ordinary, yet destined to change the entire energy in the courtroom. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but its impact would be seismic. The judge shifted slightly. One of the court officers leaned in to whisper something. Another stepped out of the room, phone pressed to his ear, face tightening as the seconds ticked by. The black man hadn't moved. He didn't need to. He had known this moment was coming. He hadn't looked at his watch, hadn't checked his phone, hadn't given the officer even the satisfaction of a raised brow. But beneath his calm exterior, he knew the call was on its way. Not a call for help, not a plea for intervention, but a confirmation. A simple trigger for a chain reaction that would upend everything the mocking officer thought he understood. On the far side of the courtroom, a clerk looked up suddenly, as if hearing something she didn't quite expect. The judge, usually composed and detached, leaned forward, eyebrows tightening with recognition as a quiet message was passed his way. Names were being spoken in hushed tones. Titles. Ranks. Affiliations that didn't belong to someone ordinary. The officer, still unaware, continued to carry himself with authority, issuing commands and glancing smugly at the man he believed to be beneath him. He didn't notice the change in posture among the courtroom staff. He didn't see the slight shift in tone when the judge called for a brief pause. He was still inside the illusion that he was in control. The courtroom doors opened slowly as another official stepped in, this one dressed differently, less like a bailiff, more like someone who belonged to another branch of power entirely. He walked directly toward the judge, whispered a few words, and handed over a folder. The judge didn't hide his reaction. His eyes widened slightly, and he looked across the room, not at the officer, but at the man who had been silent this entire time. For the first time since the proceedings began, the black man was acknowledged with something that resembled respect. Not a word was spoken, but the look said enough. The officer, sensing the change, furrowed his brow. He turned toward the judge and asked a question, but his voice no longer carried the same weight. He asked what was going on, who had come in, what had been said. But no one rushed to answer him. No one laughed at his jokes anymore. The silence that followed wasn't the same silence from before. It was heavy now. Intentional. A silence filled with revelation that hadn't yet reached his ears. The courtroom, once his playground, had grown cold. People were no longer entertained, they were alert. The man on the phone re-entered, his face pale, his walk measured. He nodded once to the clerk, who stood and whispered to the judge. The officer's name was mentioned, and so was the black man's, but not in the way he expected. His title was spoken now. Not his first name, not just, the man in the back, but a rank, a designation that did not belong to a local figure. It belonged to someone national, someone respected, someone known. The judge sat straighter, the courtroom clerk lowered her eyes, and the bailiff, who had once shared in the officer's amusement, now stood completely still. The officer's face tightened. He tried to interrupt, to clarify something, but the room no longer listened to him the same way. The dynamics had changed. The black man hadn't spoken a word, but the phone call had done the speaking for him. Now, everything that had been said before that call began to echo differently. Every joke, every sneer, every dismissive gesture now hung in the air like regret waiting to be acknowledged. The arrogance had been met not with argument, not with confrontation, but with truth, and the truth had arrived, not loudly, but through one silent, deliberate call that broke the illusion of superiority in a single moment. The room fell into a strange quiet as the name echoed from the lips of the judge, repeated in a tone that demanded attention. The officer blinked, unsure of what he had just heard, trying to piece together why the energy in the courtroom had shifted so dramatically. The clerk whispered again, this time more urgently, and the bailiff straightened like a soldier at attention. Eyes darted toward the black man in uniform, the same man who had stood silently while arrogance and prejudice played out in front of him. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't even changed his expression, but now the silence around him felt different. It was no longer filled with ridicule, it was filled with realization. A murmur started at the edges of the room. Someone gasped softly. A reporter in the back, who had been typing casually moments ago, suddenly sat upright and began writing with intensity. Another court officer whispered the man's title again, slower this time, as if to let it sink in. General. United States Army. Decorated. Highly ranked. Advisor to the Pentagon. Leader of operations overseas. The kind of resume that turned heads even in the highest circles of power. And here he was, standing quietly in a local courtroom, having just been mocked and disrespected like a nobody. The officer's confidence cracked. His eyes widened slightly, and the color began to drain from his face. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked around for support, for validation, for any indication that this was a misunderstanding. But the room had turned on him, not with hostility, but with stunned silence. Those who had chuckled earlier now looked away, ashamed. Those who had remained quiet were now watching with wide eyes, processing the weight of what had just been revealed. The truth had landed like a stone in still water, and its ripples reached everyone. General. The word carried authority, history, honor. It carried everything the officer had tried to pretend he possessed. And now, faced with the reality of who he had mocked, he began to realize the depth of his mistake. This wasn't just any man. This wasn't someone he could talk over, dismiss, or ridicule without consequence. This was a man who had led troops into battle, who had made decisions in war rooms, who had stood before presidents. And the officer, blinded by bias, had treated him like a joke. The general remained silent, allowing the weight of the moment to do the speaking. His calm was no longer misinterpreted as weakness, it was seen now for what it truly was, discipline, strength, and quiet control. The courtroom, once a place where the officer had dominated the atmosphere, now belonged to the man he had tried to diminish. The judge cleared his throat, suddenly far more respectful, addressing the general with the deference that should have been present from the start. Titles were corrected. Tones were adjusted. Everything that followed was said more carefully, more respectfully. The officer shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. Apologize? Defend himself? Pretend he had known all along? But none of those options could erase what had already been done. The room had seen him for who he truly was, and it had seen the general for who he had always been. The contrast was undeniable. Where the officer had used noise and arrogance to demand authority, the general had used silence and integrity to command it. No raised voices, no retaliation, no dramatic outbursts, just presence. Just truth. The atmosphere thickened with unspoken judgment. Not the legal kind, but the moral kind. The kind that lingers long after words are spoken. The general hadn't needed to reveal himself. The truth had found its way to the surface without a single word from him. And that made it all the more powerful. The courtroom was no longer looking at a black man in a uniform. They were looking at a leader, a national figure, someone who had earned more respect than any of them had initially given. And the officer, standing just feet away, had to confront the fact that his arrogance had been shattered not by force, but by simple, undeniable reality. The silence in the courtroom was no longer awkward or uncertain, it was reverent. Where there had once been snickers and dismissive glances, there was now stillness and wide-eyed attention. The officer who had laughed, mocked, and strutted with confidence now stood visibly smaller, not because anyone had scolded him, but because the weight of truth had stripped him of the illusion he'd built around himself. The room didn't need to hear another word to understand what had just taken place. They had witnessed something powerful, something undeniable, something that demanded reflection. People who had initially aligned themselves with the officer now avoided his gaze. Their earlier chuckles seemed shameful in retrospect. Those who had remained silent were now re-evaluating their silence. Some looked toward the general with admiration, others with regret, and still others with something deeper, guilt. Because they had seen him walk in with dignity, and they had allowed themselves to assume he didn't deserve it. Their silence had enabled the disrespect, even if they hadn't spoken a single word. Now, that silence felt heavy in their chests. The general hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't asked for respect, he had simply stood there, and now the entire room stood corrected. There was a lesson unfolding before them, not taught through lectures or rulings, but through quiet power and restraint. He had absorbed every insult, every sneer, every arrogant glance, and responded with nothing but presence. It wasn't just the officer who had been exposed. It was everyone who had looked at the color of his skin before the content of his character, everyone who had seen the uniform but missed the man inside it. The judge, earlier indifferent, was now visibly uncomfortable. His posture had shifted, his voice more cautious when addressing the general. The clerk avoided eye contact with the officer entirely. Even the bailiff stood stiffly at attention, no longer casual, no longer amused. A transformation had occurred in that room, not with drama or spectacle, but through the slow, undeniable revelation of truth. The general had not just revealed who he was, he had revealed who everyone else had been in his presence. The officer tried to reclaim his footing, to hide behind procedure, to mask his discomfort with forced professionalism, but it was too late. His words no longer carried authority. They rang hollow. His badge didn't shine as brightly anymore. Every gesture seemed awkward, every attempt at formality tinged with the memory of his earlier arrogance. He had lost something more than face, he had lost credibility. No one needed to call him out. The room had already judged him in silence. What was once laughter had turned into quiet contemplation. People were thinking, not just about what had happened, but about why it had happened. About how easy it had been to let their own assumptions lead them. About how quickly they had accepted the officer's tone as truth. About how power and prejudice often speak the same language when left unchecked. And how important it is to see past surface impressions, especially when the person standing before you is offering nothing but respect and dignity. There was no applause, no dramatic music, no speech. Just understanding. The kind of understanding that settles into people's bones and stays there. The general didn't need to educate anyone with words, he had done it with his silence, with his posture, with his patience. And in doing so, he had flipped the entire dynamic of the courtroom. The man who had entered to laughter now stood in silent triumph. Not the kind of triumph that boasts, but the kind that humbles everyone around it. The officer stood still, struggling to maintain composure, knowing that no explanation could undo what had just taken place. He had mocked a man who had earned more than he could ever understand. He had judged by appearance and spoken from assumption. And now, stripped of his assumed superiority, he stood exposed. Not by attack, but by contrast. By the calm, commanding presence of a man who had faced far worse and still chose grace. The courtroom would never forget the moment. Not because of the officer's arrogance, but because of how it was dismantled without confrontation. The silence that had once been passive had become active. Every person in that room had been changed, and not one word from the general had been required to make it happen. The same people who laughed had nothing to say now, not because they were silenced, but because they finally understood that they had been listening to the wrong voice all along.